Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria University, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am thrilled to be joined by colleague and friend, Dr. Stephen Long. Welcome to the show.
It's a great pleasure, Michael.
Glad to have you here. So Dr. Long has been teaching at Ave Maria for almost 20 years. He is a major theologian and philosopher in North America and Europe. He's an ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas at the Vatican, and has published, we have some three major philosophical and theological books, and written over 60 peer-reviewed scholarly essays. All right, at Ave Maria, I think you are best known for your formation, really, of a next generation of doctoral students, and I know they've enjoyed working with you tremendously. So thank you so much for your work and for being on the show today.
It's a wonderful grace to be here and to have been here at Ave.
That's great. And so much of your work has been at the intersection, we might say, of philosophy and theology. And you've made kind of really a career in some sense out of trying to show that theology requires a proper philosophy or philosophical understanding of the world in order to articulate the truths of theology.
Yes,
right?
Indeed.
That
yes.
To confess that we believe in one God, that we believe that God became man, these are revealed truths that we can profess in the creed, and they require certain philosophical understandings. And right, many people who are familiar with Catholic theology understand that it requires or that it makes use of philosophy. But at times, I think some people who emphasize the theological or faithful dimension can be suspicious of the role of philosophy. And at other times, people want to maybe overemphasize the kind of current, maybe the contemporary approach to philosophy in such a way to almost undermine the truths of revelation. So that's a lot of background, but I'd love to hear you. Maybe could you just say, in a word or two, kind of briefly, what do you think is why is a recovery of a proper understanding of metaphysics and philosophy so vital today in the theological enterprise?
Well, it has to do with the realism of the act of faith and the requisites of what Ratzinger referred to when he was the prefect of the CDF as the secondary object of revelation. It's also spoken of as, in terms of the preambles to the faith, that certain natural truths are required for the intelligibility of revelation. That, for example, without the principle of contradiction, which we don't have by revelation, there is no creed. Or rather, there is and isn't a creed, which is tantamount to the same thing. And there's been a tremendous flight from this because people have felt it to be an imposition of a kind of hubris, that we superimpose our own categories on reality, whereas we should receive everything from God. But whatever the truth of the ordering of creation is, it belongs to God first and to us second. And part of that truth of creation has to do with the constitution of the natural order. And certain of these truths are simply unavoidable. So one thinks of the beginning of the Summa, when Thomas addresses the question of the nature of theology and whether theology has God for its subject matter. And he says that it does, that everything in theology is either about God or about what flows from God or returns to God. But then he notes the difficulty, which is that we don't see the essence of God now. We don't know God directly. So we have a science, and when someone says, Steve, you study theology, that's very nice. What's it about? It's about God. Or do you know God? And I have to say, well, not directly. I don't know the essence of God. Oh, you don't know the essence of your subject matter. What do you study? Like, I study biology. I don't know the essence of biological life, but I study lint on creatures. It sounds as though theology is being reduced to something which is mere conjecture. And Thomas says that all the effects of God in nature and grace stand in for the lack of that direct essential knowledge, because these effects are, he considers to be demonstrably from God with respect to the natural effects, certainly with respect to being, and without being, there's no possibility of revelation. God doesn't reveal to a non-existent creature. So the whole belongs to God and is contained in the divine providence. And people became restless about this, and they thought of it as a confining thing, which mystifies me and so many others who discover Aquinas these days, because it opens up the riches of the tradition in a way that's so singularly fruitful.
Yeah.
But that's the reason we need philosophy is that, well, all the effects of nature and grace stand in for the lacking direct essential knowledge of God. What is the principal, primary, proper effect of God? Being. God is the creator, and we're not saved by non-existent grace. We're not saved by, we're not aided by that which isn't. And so the study of being is intimately tied with revelation. And Thomas goes so far as to say in the commentary on the sentences in the first scriptum that the relation of createdness is a kind of an accident in the creature that proceeds from having being from another. And to have being from another absolutely requires having being. So while it sounds good, it sounds very good to say something like, man is constituted by his relation to God. That sounds like the kind of thing that ought to be true. It's pleasant to say it. You feel like you're sitting with really deep thinkers when you speak in this way. But man isn't constituted by the relation to God, he's constituted by God. And the relation is what follows upon his being. And so at the very ground of creation, the very foundation of everything that follows, there is the primacy of being and substance and nature. And it has a structure imbued in it by God from the beginning. And it has a narrative. It has a narrative because we're not just created in a state of pure nature, we're created from the beginning in grace. And in that narrative, the causalities can be contemplated and seen and enable us to have a very rich appreciation of the synthesis of nature and grace and the theological tradition. I'm doing a very bad job of this.
I think you're doing a great job of unfolding it. And it reminds me, there's a lot of the Greek or Eastern icons of Jesus, sometimes known as the Pantocrator, the creator of everything, but it will say haon in the Greek, which is the being one. And the idea is that Jesus is the being one because God is being itself. And so it's a reference to the divine nature, but the reference to God is a metaphysical attribution of being. And then all of the creatures are not haon. They're not being itself. They're what Aquinas will call participated being. We receive our being. The being that we have is a being that is participating in the divine essence. And so I think that way of articulating it shows in a way the just the kind of the reality of creation. And therefore, if God, who is the creator, is also our savior and redeemer, he doesn't leave behind creation in saving us. He actually does it through creation. So, in 1998, John Paul II wrote Fides et Ratio. He began that with a great image, right? Faith and reason are two wings, like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And I think, and then it goes further to say that it presents Aquinas as a model of how a master of thought, as it puts it in 43 of Fides et Ratio, the church has been justified in consistently proposing St. Thomas as a master of thought and a model of the right way to do theology. And it does this specifically referring to the harmony between faith and reason, that Thomas recognized that nature, philosophy's proper concern could contribute to an understanding of divine revelation. So could you say more about, you've been kind of an unabashed Thomist throughout all of your studies, and I think we are seeing now more of a revival, at least among some circles, of a study of Thomas. But when you first started studying theology in the late 70s, 80s, studying Thomas was was a little rebellious in those days.
Yeah. I didn't realize how infra-dig it had become. I really didn't, but I discovered fairly swiftly. The point you make about John Paul II's treatment of Thomas and his lauding of Thomas it's important because that language is often interpreted, as you know, in a systematically different way than one might think John Paul II intended. That is, he's a master of thought, he's a model of what is to be done. So just as he baptized Aristotle, we need to baptize Foucault, or we need to baptize historicism, or we need to baptize Marxism or something. And the view came to be held for reasons that I've never quite understood how speedily it happened, but Thomas came to be viewed, this whole tradition came to be viewed as like a lace doily, that if you picked it up, it might collapse. It might just fall to dust in your hands. It was a relic more to be observed and honored than to be used. And so you circumnavigated around it, as you do in the kitchen when some artifact of great worth were being cleaned, but you knew its purpose was to be exhibited at conspicuous moments and then to be hidden lest someone harm it. It can be viewed that way. And you see this in the most central propositions. The distinction of act and potency is just short. To mention, when I came into theology, to be concerned with that was just short of being a member of the Musketeer Club, the Mickey Mouse Club. It's like, oh, do you have a butch haircut and do you shine your shoes? How nice, that. But real theology is done otherwise. But the very thing we were talking about, which is the nature of createdness. Well, what distinguishes the creature is the limitation of its perfection. And the limit, Thomas, it's very interesting, when Thomas speaks of participation, early on, he sees its theological richness. But then he begins to ask himself, again, the philosophic question, why is it that the totality of a participated perfection, truth, being, truth, goodness, isn't possessed by the creature? His answer is it's received according to the limits of potentia. It's limited by potency. That limitation and multiplicity and change all presuppose the division of being by act and potency. And the philosophical account of that is bracing, but in fact it runs through the most Platonic thesis, as it were, in Thomas's corpus. He gives, after De Veritate, what you might call an Aristotelianized account of it, because it's a function of the nature of created being as limited by potency of esse as received in and limited by essence. So these distinctive theses, they have far more theological megatonnage than might be thought. And when they were put aside, it's not surprising that so many other things went quickly. I mean, Bertrand Russell put it aside like this. Frege comes up with this view that being is only the negation of nothing. So being is a number. It means there's one. But you could have one concept, and that doesn't mean that the object of the concept exists, right? So if I say being is only the negation of naught, and we apply this conceptually, well, I have the concept of a 1,000-headed tarantula that breathes flame and sings La Traviata at midnight, and I say none of these fails to read Greek at 1 o'clock. How many of them are actually reading Greek at 1 o'clock? None, right? So Frege is wrong, right? He's a brilliant Platonist mathematical logician, but from mathematical logic to phenomenology to La Nouvelle Theologie to the proportionalist rebellion, the whole Thomist thing was unraveled, but the unraveling began at the height and passed all the way down. And that's intriguing to me that it should be so, because you might think it's quasi-accidental. I mean, often these things are, right? I mean, what people hold is so rarely a matter of systematic, right? I mean, we pick up our ideas, as Newman points out, through a complex amalgam of experiences and probabilities and gradual presentiments that move us. And you might think, well, this must have happened in such a way, but it in fact it began. It's a little bit more like a nuclear explosion that began at the center and then radiated out.
Mm-hmm. So I'll just then, because I think that has been, and many people, have referred to your work over the last 20, 30 years of trying to maintain this tradition of realist metaphysics, or kind of an understanding of you have a book on the teleological grammar of the moral act that's been very well received. Of course, also a lot of object of controversy. But this idea of trying to maintain, the philosophical ability to discern aspects of the created world, and so therefore also reason to, in a way that does not grasp, but reasons to the existence of the Creator and attributes, right, or like aspects of the Creator's existence, even if we don't understand them positively, at least we can speak of them meaningfully. That this actually shapes really a lot of our kind of theological, like our Christian living on faith and morals, because this allows us to say certain things that are true. It allows us to speak of the moral life in a way that is true, like actions truly are something. Yeah. And I think what many people, by kind of adopting this, I don't know what you want to call it, but a phenomenalist, or some, as John Paul II will speak of, philosophy that doesn't move from phenomena to foundation, right? It lacks a kind of wisdom, sapiential, an aspect of speaking truth, some aspect of having a metaphysical dimension, that we end up then with, an inability to actually know what human nature is, and to know which actions will make human beings happy, and which actions will make human beings, eternally kind of frustrated. So could you kind of connect a little bit of that, those questions about, metaphysics and philosophy to our understanding of human nature and the moral life?
Yeah, this is bound up with the affirmation that God is the author of all creation, and imbues it with an order from the beginning. Now we know that it's an order both in nature and in grace because we're created in grace. But there's a natural order, and the whole of this, with the metaphysical fixity being lost, the sense of final causality, of end, was very quickly became reduced to a mere positive individual preference, rather than that for the sake of which a thing is and acts. So that there is an order of ends impressed upon the human creature from creation, that we wouldn't be, that we go right and wrong about the same things by nature. That the things we go wrong about are the things we can go right about through virtue. That we're ordered to certain ends prior to any choice, and this order is ethically significant because the creature cannot meaningfully be perfected by certain kinds of acts at all. Even if someone were to fall into this with a confused conscience after sincerely seeking the truth and simply out of confusion had fallen into a bad form of moral action, this wouldn't make that form of action perfective. It would remain destructive. So all of the what you might call the Aristotelian analysis of the four causes in the moral life were subject to a dissolvent.
Yeah. Would you just comment briefly, sort of maybe members of the audience who aren't immediately familiar with the four causes, would you just kind of mention them, explain them? Because I do think that sense of the loss of the final and even sometimes the formal cause really is destructive. But could you kind of walk through those
the cause of causes, as Thomas puts it, the cause of causes is the end, because everything's for the sake of the end. The efficient cause or the agent cause is that which brings about an action for what? For the sake of the end. So in a way, the final cause is the cause of efficiency. Without finality, there isn't efficiency. People are confused about this. Searle, the very prominent analytic mind, Searle, he was at a conference when he was saying, we can only have efficient causes, no final causes. Now it's in a row of people, all of whom just went, because if action brings about one thing rather than another, that's an end. And without an end, you don't have any conception of efficient causality. Why do you call someone takes notes? You say, what are you doing? I'm taking notes. Why do you call it taking notes? Because that's what it brings about. It doesn't bring about milking of the cow. That's why I call milking the cow. Well, that's, that brings about the milking of the cow. So the cause of causes is the final cause. There have been 4 centuries of very learned and caustic opposition to the reality of final causality, but the arguments don't hold water. Now, I'm going to forget his name. This is bloody awful. There's a beautiful essay on this in the Thomist, and I'm going to forget the author's name. If it comes to me later, I'll say.
No worries. We can put it in the show notes later if you want.
That's right.
So,
So that the end is primary, and that the order to the end is impressed on the creature. How would I ever be capable of desiring to know if I had no principle in me that were in any way ordered or orderable to knowing? Not possible.
Mm-hmm.
How would I ever be able to desire to eat? Does a rock desire to eat? Does a pond of water wish to become a thespian? This is not possible, right? So the formal cause, we talked about final and efficient causality. The formal cause is what makes a thing the kind of thing it is. And it can be either the form in a narrow way or in a broader way, which is to say essence. And the material cause is more difficult. I mean, in the obvious way, you can say it's the stuff things are made of, but that stuff always has some character. but to account for change, you have to get to potency as such. And the treatment of that would be, that takes time to understand that. But that, for example, wood does not become ash. The thing that is wooden becomes ashen, but if wood became ash, then you would build your house out of ash, and you don't, right? The thing that is wooden becomes ashen. There's a principle which is purely potential, which only exists in relation to form, to some determinate structural principle. It only exists in relation to form. And without that, we can't account for manyness, limit, and change. And in fact, we can't even apply the principle of contradiction to real things.
Yeah. And so this is one of those things that, Francis Bacon, who's often seen as one of the kind of the great philosophers of the scientific revolution, but he very much rejected the formal causality, final causality, and tried to reduce everything to efficient and material causality. The idea, but the scientific project itself necessitates that what happens when things change is understandable, is intelligible, which is only possible if there's a formal and a final causality.
Yeah, even Descartes can't help it that his geometrized universe is an end of study.
Yeah,
it's a kind of an end. Final causality is ineluctable. The effort, but there's a lot of our moral thought that has lived in the idea that if there is some sort of structuring of the created order, even if there is one, it's only a kind of stage setting. But the real play, the real action, is simply a matter of the intention of the agent, and that's what counts singularly and solely. Well, it certainly is primary in a way, but what I choose is equally primary. What I intend is crucial, and what I choose to do in relation to what I choose or to what I intend is crucial. And what I choose ought to be choice-worthy, objectively choice-worthy. It's not enough that I can present an account of it. I can say, as I choke my grandmother to death, I'm not really killing her, I'm only relieving her suffering. It may be that the end I have is simply relieving her suffering, but the means I've chosen, in fact, by their nature, relieve her is something else, namely life. And so what I'm choosing isn't just my own account. What I'm choosing is the action itself, and it ought to be a good action. It ought to be an action that is fruitfully orderable to a good end. And choking one's grandmother to death doesn't tend to be such an action. I mean, unless she comes at you with an axe or something, which is a really sad moment in the history of grandmothering.
Well, hopefully you can fend her off.
That's right.
But this, I think, really, I think the way that it's often portrayed, kind of almost, to describe it is people tend to perceive that freedom is the ability to do what I want, is the ability to choose whatever I want to choose. That's freedom. And so this idea that there's an end for the sake of which the human creature has been created seems restrictive. And so therefore people want to they exalt kind of the freedom to choose and kind of turn away from the end of our human nature. And as you pointed out, then, if you were to do that again with the moral, with actions, then actions are always going to be redescribable based upon our intentions, or maybe this falls into intentionalism or consequentialism, but they're not actually, they're not doing anything reliably in the real world that is just like, no, that's an act of murder because that's the depriving of life of an innocent person. That's adultery. That's that's also, on the other side of it, that's an act of love. You
see this in an important way in the confusions about dignity today, because there is an inceptive dignity, right? We're beings of such a nature as to be ordered or orderable to noble ends in nature and grace. And these ends in nature of grace are common goods. That is, they're goods of their nature, more communicable to many. So the conversation we're having is a common good. The coffee I'm drinking is a private good. I have it or you have it. And there's an order of such common goods, though, all the way to the beatific vision. And so there's a certain dignity we have just by being a creature ordered in this way. And part of that dignity is indeed our freedom. That is our intellective ability, capacity to overpass whatever the object is that is presented to us. You can stand before the person of Christ himself and find him to be too much and go have a ham and cheese sandwich instead, right? I mean, it's true. So, but that inceptive dignity is for the sake of the achievement of those noble ends. And the achievement of those ends signifies an objectively loftier dignity. So, but you have that inceptive dignity in a state of alienation from your neighbor, from your own better destiny, from all those you love and who love you, from the providence of God trying to coax you to the life of charity. And I would say, although it will discountenance our friends who are universalists, you can have it in hell. It isn't the complete dignity of the human person. The complete dignity is that for the sake of which that dignity exists. Yeah. And that freedom is ordered to find its perfection in Christ.
Yeah, it's not so much a freedom from constraint or freedom to do whatever I want. That freedom is really just the kind of capacity, but the freedom is really for God. We have the freedom to know and to love that which is truly knowable and lovable, which is God. So we're at the time of our break. We're going to take a brief break, and then when we come back, I'd like to, I want to just hear a little bit more about. I think a lot of our listeners or viewers would love to just hear a little bit about some of, the challenges maybe that you kind of encountered in some of your studies when, as I said, to kind of try to go back and study Thomas was really, kind of put you on the outside of the theological and philosophical world within mainstream Catholic life in North America and even Europe. So I'd like to return to that a little bit, but we'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
Yeah, Steve, it's been great talking with you about this and kind of considering just why philosophy matters for theology. And now John Paul II in his Fides Oratio says that philosophy matters for theology, but he also says that you need a proper kind of philosophy. He gives 3 examples of it in paragraph 83, where he says it has to be sapiential, it has to be able to see the whole and discover some kind of meaning. It has to be analytical, it has to be able to say something truthful, that there's some kind of adequacy or adjustment of the mind to the reality of the thing, and that it also has to be metaphysical, move from phenomenon to foundation. So these are he also says, of course, this doesn't mean that we, I like the way he puts it as well, because he's also, where he says it's true and certain, albeit imperfect and analogical, right? So we truly know things, but we don't know everything, right? But it also is the case, though, that the 20th century, really the last 400 years, or, well, anyway, a long time, but especially, say, in the last 50 years, and in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, the dominant trends in philosophical thought have not been have been, they have not been conducive to saying that the human mind can come to know truth. And if we can't know truth, then all revelation by definition is going to be, either wishful thinking or emotional sentiment.
Yeah.
Could you tell a little bit about your own background as a student and kind of the world of really, and it wasn't just kind of the West philosophy in North America and in Europe, but was also within Catholic institutions.
Yeah.
What were some of the trends, and what do you think were some of their problems, and what was your kind of story for navigating this and kind of discovering almost on your own at first, and then following this great thread of Thomistic tradition?
This is a great invitation to take a walk down memory lane, because I do think these recollections are more helpfully instructive about the history that we've just passed through, and than might be thought. I came into the church after reading Newman and Aquinas and a variety of other authors, but those two principally. And when I began doing graduate study in philosophy, the entire world was still in the grip of the linguistic turn in analytic thought. And what wasn't in the grip of that linguistic turn was part of the ancien regime of more metaphysically projected logicism, positivism. I had, for example, the gentleman who helped me with my MA thesis was an Advaitin Vedantin Hindu with PhDs in mathematics and physics and in philosophy. And but it was becoming very quickly the norm, the linguistic turn, and it was very common to simply end conversations by saying, "I don't know what you mean." Normally, that's the beginning of a conversation. You begin to say, "Well, this," and you work things out. It may turn out you're trying to say something that you can't articulate well, or maybe it's just confused. But it was part of the punctual treatment of antecedent thought. That is, I got most of my collection of philosophic works, or a lot of it, out of the garbage bin when libraries were throwing out all of their Aquinas. They were just throwing it out. And they would have thrown out Aristotle, but something told them, no, we can't quite do that, but we can certainly put him in his place. So these things became objects of classics departments or medieval history, because and where you had to say, look, we're not doing anything speculative, we're just doing history. Nothing subversive here. You can go right on with what you're doing. And this was so much the case. I mean, I remember when I gave my first paper when I was going to CUA, and I was engaging de Lubac on Nature and Grace, and I was very surprised to get hissed at. People actually hissed at, and I thought, well, I thought these days of intense animosity about this were over. There are differences, but surely now we can converse about them. There's real closure with respect to them still. And this was in the older set, because in the newer set you had Charles Curran, you had proportionalism, you had, right? So you were either locked out of the conversation on the grounds that the antecedent tradition foreclosed it, that say the 30 years between 1940 and 1970 were the canon of Catholic thought. And if you weren't in correspondence with what it indicated, you were either doing history or you should shut up, or you were in the proportionalist revolution.
And the proportionalists in the 70s and afterwards were basically dissenters who
Charlie Curran
dissented on Humanae Vitae most famously,
abortion,
but on abortion, and just kind of all moral acts were redescribable based upon conscience or other. I mean, they're more specific, but that's for ways, and in some ways too, even not only and almost the same with doctrine. And also kind of with the sacraments, that
these
everything
things
ended
go.
up being revisable based upon the dissenting theologians.
Yeah. I mean, I think it did start at the height. I honestly do think that although what was most conspicuous to everyone was the moral antinomianism of the post-conciliar period, but I think that the groundwork for that was set speculatively with this idea that there's no fixed conceptual content to doctrine, that it's all merely a kind of approach which can constantly be revolutionized and even altered. But morally, I think a lot of people thought when you remove the account of proportionate nature in this sort of natural law mode of thought from the scene, what will happen is that impediments to divine contemplation will be removed. Everyone will be like this. But in fact, what happened is everyone was doing this. That is, there was the loss of the created order, which has to be included in the moral account, had been relativized. And good luck maintaining a theistic account of morals in any way consonant with the Catholic tradition anyway, without an account of the created natural order. You know, this is something, as you know, Benedict was very strong about, because he notes that at one point he thought Scripture could supply all of the needed moral categories. But Christ, the incarnation didn't happen to reveal the nature of adultery. We already knew what it was. We didn't need the incarnation of the divine word to make theft intelligible to us or murder. It's the communion in the inner life and love of the Trinity and the healing of nature. We need it for that. But how is it we know these other things? I mean, the tradition is that the Ten Commandments repromulgate the natural law after the fall. After the fall, Thomas is very mordant about it. He says it's the time of the natural law between the fall and the repromulgation of the natural law, the Decalogue, because we can know that order, but we're in the grips of so fundamental and inclinational weakening and disarray that we can't make anything of it. And it requires the divine aid. I mean, we can do certain good acts, but to have moral virtue in the full density requisite. And this is something else, by the way, Thomas is really profound about, that we probably haven't time to pursue. But his whole treatment of the reasons why, after we're elevated again in sanctifying grace, we need acquired natural moral virtue. It's beautiful. But anyway, all of this got like the croupier at the gambling table. It just got raked off the table because it was thought to be confining, insufficiently scriptural, not personalist. But of course, the order of nature is predicated of the person. And we've seen the utter effects of this today, right? Everyone can see this now who wants to see it. That is the whole view that human nature is merely an identification that we subjectively make. How about if I identify myself as the giver and taker of life? I identify as death. I'm here to harvest you. Now, should the law acknowledge my self-identification? And this is ridiculous. There's an order impressed on nature, and all of this got raked away. I'm sorry, I moved very far from your...
I think this is really helpful, and I think what you raise at the end is, again, I think, John Paul II discusses this in Veritatis Splendor in 1993, but just this idea that freedom and law seem to somehow be opposed to one another, but instead God's law actually is the kind of reveals to us the structure of our own being so that it helps us to actualize our freedom. We become more free when we follow the law, because the law is not really, it is something somewhat external to us insofar as it assists us, but it's also kind of already in us, because we have a certain nature that has an order to it.
Yeah. It's like grammar in a sentence, right? You can say the sentence is grammatical, but the sentence isn't grammar. And there's a grammar to the order of creation.
Yeah.
And that order, when we receive it intelligently as giving us reasons to act and reasons not to act, that's the natural law.
Now, I think some people will criticize this and have criticized your work in different ways, or the Catholic tradition really, as a kind of physicalism with the idea that, I remember one time being at a debate with between an atheist and a theist, so to speak, on creation. And the atheist was saying, look, God didn't do a very good job creating the world because I need to wear glasses. So, right, this idea that somehow, like there's no order because we need glasses, or this idea that if we say that our natural being is good, well, and we can't redefine it, then, why do we shave, right? Or why do we wear glasses? Or why do we wear shoes, right? All of these sorts of things that people sometimes have this idea that, wait a second, well, if it's the case that isn't it the case that human beings have always kind of used technology and culture to shape our physical existence and make it more livable? So how would you kind of distinguish between, things like, I don't know, whether or not they're cosmetic, glasses, shoes versus like ways of like, artificial contraception or other ways of kind of dealing with our ability to identify ourselves however we wish.
Those things are sort of comical. That is, for example, why is it, you might ask them, that we distinguish between shaving and, say, castration? There are acts which are naturally helpful given the kind of being we are. And for certain purposes, shaving is helpful. Now you can say, well, purposes are just relative to your state of technology. People have different empirical purposes. That's true. If you go to the mall and say, what is happiness to you? And some people say meth. And some people say being a concert pianist. And those people say watching YouTube or something. But there's also the normative object of wish. That is, there's an order in human nature to certain goods. And to suppose that, say, the ordering to truth or the ordering to God is not architectonic, or to suppose that we don't have an order to health at all. I have just no obligation whatsoever, even minimally, to care for my own health. It's entirely a matter of my subjective disposition, just like what paint I put on the canvas. If I want to be an expressionist, I'll do it. If I want to be an abstract artist, I'll do it. If I want to cut off my thumb, I'll do it. What's the artist who did that? I forget his name. Who cut off his ear.
Yeah, I think it was Van Gogh.
Van Gogh did it. Yeah.
I don't think he was happy though at that time.
No. Well,
He might have been in emotional distress.
Yeah, he gave us some good paintings, but but anyway, this view it reminds me very much of that charming essay that Germain Grisey and John Boyle and Finnis put out. I think they were responding to Jean Porter, and it was about the nature of action. And they were saying that when a baby can't pass the birth canal, that the question was, can you crush the skull? And this used to be a major question. The church was always said no. It can't be taught you should do it. And when it was asked, can we do it at all? We just say no. But they were saying, well, when you crush the skull, you're not directly intending to kill. You just want to save the mother. And you can't save the mother unless the baby gets out the birth canal, and you can't do that unless you crush the skull. So crushing the skull is just a side effect of saving the mother. And when you're asked what kind of act you're doing when you crush the skull, they say, you're not really harming the child. And I would have paid the money to say this. It's a venial fault on my part, but I would have paid the money to say this. And they actually said it without any inducement from me. They said, you're not really harming the child. You're merely altering the dimensions of the skull. Well, Obviously, that's not true. That is, if you say, what does the action principally and first bring about? It brings about the destruction of the skull of the child. And the child is not a malefactor threatening anyone. Even if it's in the wrong place, that's as bad for it as it is for the mother. And just as the mother isn't the cause of it, neither is the child. So this form of thought becomes a kind of bending of the knee to expediency, and it's hard to cope with because you're really dealing with something foundational. That is, if we're not subject to an order prior to choice, which is normative, then inventing a natural law that is simply on our own private capital, that isn't founded in the created order itself, that doesn't receive its divine stamp from God himself, that doesn't follow the impress of the divine causality, well, then we're talking about objects in the supermarket. We have this designer account of morals. We have another one. This one will help you make your choices better. But it collapses into, I don't think they meant it to collapse into relativism, by the way. I'm not saying that. I think Finis is an earnest fellow, and a lot of these people are earnest. But it collapses because it lacks realism. If we're not permeatingly subject to an order, then the intelligence is not going to discover the ratio for action that it needs as an immutable guide. There is such an order or there isn't. So I'm sort of hike the ball down the center, Thomist in this. That is, we can't substitute for the lack of realism downstream. Once you sever that bond, you're free-floating.
Yeah, and I think this is what John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor, paragraph 79, wrote this when he said, right, one must reject the thesis characteristic of teleological and proportionalist theories, which holds that it is impossible to qualify as morally evil according to its species, its object, the deliberate choice of certain kinds of behavior or specific acts, right, apart from a consideration of the intention, right, or the consequences. And so this basic idea that, right, that there are actions that are as such harmful to the flourishing of human nature.
Yeah, there's certain acts by their nature can't conduce to a good life.
Yeah.
Any more than you can freeze water by melting snow.
Yeah, and I think this idea also kind of shapes a little bit of, it sounds at first to be maybe a little bit hard or rigorous, but it actually sets up an order in which we're also looking that all moral questions are about our happiness, are about we are the kind of creatures that were created to know and love God forever in perfect communion with him, or at least as perfect as we can have as creatures. We were created in grace to be his children. And in that sense, when we want to follow the moral law ourselves, which we can't do apart from Christ, we just don't have we're too defective or, confused. But we can in Christ. But when we do that, or if we point that way out to others, it's not for the sake of trying to, I don't know how to put it, control externally, to impose our views upon them. It's to open up an idea that if you want to be happy over a lifetime, and if you want to be happy over eternity, reconsider the choice you're making now, or consider rectifying that choice. Because certain actions we will do, they may seem good for tonight, they may seem good for this year, but it's like if we think about that over a lifetime, how will that turn out? And we think about that over eternity, how will that?
What does it lead to?
So this idea of taking this idea, if there's an order, then we can find happiness with God as his children. If there's not an order and it's all up to our choosing and our intention and our consequences, then ultimately we can't somehow attain the Creator.
And you know, the line you quoted, it is important to note that earlier in Veritatis Splendor, he observes that the natural law is essentially teleological. So the use of teleology there is with respect to this consequentialist idea.
Yeah. So what do you mean when you say the natural, just to be clear? So here we're talking about a positive sense in which the natural law is teleological. It's ordered to an end?
Yeah, there's an order of ends from the beginning in nature and grace to God, in nature proportionate to, as Thomas will say, we have a natural love of God from creation, above all things, as the beginning and end of natural good, and inferior to grace, inferior to charity, a natural love, which gets lost with the fall. And then there's the love of charity, which is the participation in the divine love itself. So moral reflection, because it has to do with the right order to God, it has to do with the right order of ends, is ineluctably teleological. But this idea that you can reduce the rectitude of action just to what you propose to yourself, because we're very gifted rationalizers. We all know this about ourselves. We can always find a way to rationalize, and it's by the nature of certain actions, these cannot be ordered to a good end. They can't be ordered fruitfully to our perfection or to our healing or to fellowship with our fellows or to communion with God. And that's a very important thing. And the idea, you know, he lambasts in Veritatis Splendor the fundamental option idea that the only morally significant question is, are you open to God or not? And meanwhile, you can be running a concentration camp, I guess, and no action by its nature could be dissevering from union with God. Whereas in the tradition, in what the church has always taught, is that there's a lowest threshold with respect to action, and there's a floor, and beneath that one is no longer ordering oneself to a good end.
Yeah, and you know, the Catechism will also emphasize the idea that there can be times in which, say, circumstances, perhaps the person's emotional distress, you know, mental illness or other things may compromise the person's ability to act volitionally.
Oh, of course.
So the person may not be as culpable, but the action is never as good. And I think this is really important. And the other side of it is if there are actions that are truly bad, it also means there are actions that are truly good. And which means that we can actually also, some of our suffering and sacrifices, and even say our acts of faith, hope, and love are also real and are also productive and conducive of the good that we're seeking to bring us closer to God, which is not only important in us, but it's extremely important in Jesus Christ, right? If actions as such were not real in an actual order, then Christ's love on the cross and accepting that suffering with love would not constitute the renewal of the entire creation. So this idea that if bad actions aren't possible or are intrinsically revisable based upon our intention, then good actions are just the same thing. And they're always revisable based upon our intentions. And we really become trapped within ourselves. And we're not in the objective world by which we can actually attain to genuine communion with God because of what God has done. And it's not accidental that John Paul II ends Veritatis Splendor with a consideration of martyrdom, right? What Jesus did in giving his life, what martyrs do in giving their lives is genuinely noble. It's an act of happiness.
The immutability of the natural law is not a confinement, it's a liberation, but it's a liberation that does in certain ways imply martyrdom. Because at the margin, one is called to affirm the truth even at the cost of one's own well-being.
Yeah. We are coming up to the end of our time together today. I do want to ask you 3 questions that I like to ask my guests, just quick, short ones. What's a book you've been reading?
Oh, gee whiz. I've been reading about 4 of them, so I don't know where to start.
Well, that's why I ask, what's a book? So the
the
guest gets to choose.
I get to choose. Well, I've been looking over again a lot of Aristotelian texts, to tell you the truth, and the metaphysics, and I've also been reading some history and some theological essays. I've been looking at Nicola's systematic theology, that wonderful translation by Meinard, just peachy. It's really impressive. You see why Ratzinger thought so highly of it.
Mm-hmm. That's a new series
out of Catholic U.
Out of Nicola's systematic theology. So, second question: what's a spiritual practice you do on a regular basis to grow closer to God?
The rosary, and just prayer, general, private, contemplative prayer. I have a beautiful little Chihuahua whom you know, Eggs, and we take these long walks, although they're getting shorter because he has a heart ailment, and it's naturally conducive to prayer. Those things, and of course the Mass.
Yeah,
the Mass. Yeah.
That's great. And since this is a show on Catholic theology, right? Ideas, what we believe about God matters. All right. So, what's a belief you held about God that you discovered was false, and what was the truth?
Oh, gee whiz, that's so easy.
See?
That's so easy, because when I was working on my MA thesis, I actually included in it material heresy. No, process thinkers wouldn't agree with me, but I inadvertently implied there was a real relation of God to the creature. But God infinitely transcends the creature. I do not make God's day. If I did not exist, God would not weep. In fact, of course, you might think I'm at least grateful for this. He wouldn't rejoice that I didn't exist, but he's in permanent rejoicing. That is, yeah. But I was wrong about that. I mean, I stumbled in, and this is a reason to be concerned about the way that logic and philosophic discourse progresses, because you really need, if you don't have the groundwork intellectually of theism, you're going to start thinking in terms of God as really related to the creature. And now you've got the elimination of the transcendence of revelation and of God. You might think you don't have God at all anymore once you make that move. You have a reality in the world that is higher than some, but that is limited and changing. And in the traditional view of theism, then you need to find what accounts for that.
Yeah, to really discover the true creator,
mm-hmm.
Of course, is our that is our destiny, and that God would be God doesn't become happier when he shares his happiness with his creatures.
Yeah.
Right. But nonetheless, his happiness is truly shared, and his creatures become infinitely happier, especially since they did not exist at all. And so it's a glorious thing. But God doesn't need us to be God, but we certainly need God to be us.
Yes,
so we are at the end of our time. For people who are interested in reading more, I think the one book that I think can really be helpful is the Teleological Grammar of the Moral Act. There's a second edition that has a revised introduction of about 40 pages. So that people, I think almost 50 pages that people might find interesting with Sapientia Press. You can find Sapientia Press published by Ave Maria University online, and there's a code CT10 to get a 20% discount. And the Sapientia books are available on the Catholic University of America Press website. But Steve, thank you so much for being on the show, for talking about really your own philosophical and theological studies and journey, and your willingness to kind of follow through and try to recover Thomas, I guess both in season and out of season.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great pleasure to converse with you.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.